All right, so good evening and good morning to everyone from North America, China, and Australia. I'm Patty Lee, Director of the Confucius Institute at Webster University. Welcome to the China Urban Study Author Talk Series. This talk series aims at creating a virtual platform for international scholarly exchange when conventional scholarly activities are disrupted by the pandemic. It also seeks to introducing to scholars and the general public the newly scholarships in the field of China urban studies. Today, we are honored to have Professor Richard Hu from University of Canberra, Australia. He will speak about his book, Global Shanghai Remade, The Rising of Pudong New Area. Professor Hu is an award-winning urban planner and an educator and scholar. He is currently a professor at Canberra Business School at the University of Canberra, Australia. His work integrates urban design, urban science, and urban policy to address contemporary urban transformations and challenges with a focus on Asia-Pacific region. He has numerous publications, and his latest book is The Shenzhen Phenomenon from a Fishing Village to Global Knowledge City, published in 2020, which will be available on Amazon soon. Welcome, Professor Hu. It's an honor to have you here.
Thank you, Patty.
Yeah. Today's talk will be moderated by Professor Rick Forrestal. Rick is my colleague who has been directing Webster University China program since 1997. Since his arrival in Shanghai, Rick has been an active participant in the Shanghai American Chamber of Commerce, chaired an early entrepreneurs committee, and served as the first chair of the marketing committee, and also served on the board of directors. This is Rick's 24th year in China. I think among all the participants today, maybe Rick might be the top few who has witnessed the rise of Pudong area. And I'd also like to mention that because of work by Rick and the other colleagues, this year Webster University celebrates 25 years MBA program in China. And our partnership include Shanghai University of Finance and Economics, and the University of Electronic Science and Technology of China in Chengdu. And we also have our partner University of Confucius Institute, that is Beijing Language and Cultural University. All right, welcome, Rick. Before I give floor to the two Shanghai experts, and I'd like to extend my thanks to our colleagues at Webster University, both in St. Louis and in Shanghai, for your strong support. And also to Professor Kang Ling and Dr. Wang Yu from Chinese and Comparative Study Association for the great collaboration to make this author talk series possible. Okay, so now Rick, I'm turning the talk to you.
Patty, thank you very much. And I don't want to spend a lot of time. I just want to start with a question, because there's a lot to cover. Why, Dr. Hu, why is Shanghai so important for our consideration? Not just as a leading urban center, but what can we learn from its success, which is so well taught in Global Shanghai Remade? This is a Chinese question or an opportunity to see. Okay.
Thank you, Rick. And that's a good question to start my presentation in a short while. I'd like, before I make the presentation, to address your starting question and all the other points of this book. I'd like to thank Patty and thank Rick and all the other organizers who made this event possible, and I appreciate the opportunity to make the presentation and to share and discuss the points of our common interest. Is there?
Yeah, great.
Okay, great. Look, and this presentation may take a little bit more than 20 minutes. So as Rick raised, why a book? Why a book about Global Shanghai Remade and about the Pudong new area? Because it happens that last year marked the 30th anniversary of the Chinese government's decision to develop and open Pudong. So there are different ways of reading Pudong and Shanghai, and from different angles in China and elsewhere. And the two authors, Wei Jie Cheng and I, decided that there should be a book, because there has not been a book to address such a big urban project. And for us, we try to provide a sort of like perspective from the inside, and that could also work as a prism of China's urbanization and transformation, not just in the past 30 years, probably in the past 40 years since China's reform in 1978. Because my collaborator, Wei Jie Cheng, has been working on this project since 1995. 5 years later, after the Pudong project started. And before my academic life, I was a practitioner and working in Chinese cities, Beijing and Shanghai. So we felt that, you know, we could do something together to provide a sort of like insights and information that couldn't be, you know, accessed or interpreted as otherwise. So what this book is about, this is a book, and we, in this presentation, I just focused on the major points: who made the decision, who were the major actors, and why this project happened at that time, and how that happened, and to address the opening questions by Rick. So from this skyline of Pudong, we could tell that the change from 1990 until today, it has been, you know, drastic, and you know, the whole city just erected within 3 decades. So this scale and this, you know, a speed of urban construction is unusual and in modern city history, and it's hardly paralleled and in history or elsewhere. So we try to, you know, provide some not just a chronicle, but some kind of like explaining factors and the context to underpin and this kind of like transformation. So a bit of history would help us better grapple the new Shanghai as we see today. Shanghai in the Chinese urban system or Chinese cities is pretty a young city or new city in a way compared with those ancient capital cities like Beijing, Xi'an, or numerous other cities. So Shanghai started as Shanghai's modern history started in 1843, and you know, after the Qing dynasty government lost the Opium War to the British Army, and it was forced to open as a part city for foreign trade, and from 1843. So that's the origin of the city's history. And since then, for nearly 1 century, Shanghai was a dual city. There was a Chinese Shanghai and a foreign Shanghai because of the presence of the foreign settlements. So the city had a also, you know, in that period, the city also had a rapid transformation. So nearly 1 century later, by around 1920 to 30s, Shanghai already had a population of around 4 million. And it was a world financial and economic center in the Far East. And its, you know, newest architecture, technology, its cosmopolitanism, put Shanghai in the same mark as London, New York, Chicago, Paris, and Tokyo at the time. So that part of the Shanghai's history represent the city's, sort of like golden age or glorious history, but that glorious history belonged to the old Shanghai or even colonial Shanghai, and that was before 1949. And that old Shanghai, as we know, existed in the western part of the Huangpu River, the Puxi part. And as we know that, so since 1949, the region changed from to the People's Republic of China. However, to remake a new Shanghai, the effort didn't start from Pudong, because actually it started from around early 1920s. The nationalist revolutionary Sun Yat-sen, he made a plan in 1920 and to redevelop the Pudong and to rebuild a new Shanghai. As I just shared that Shanghai was a Jewish city because there was a foreign Shanghai in Puxi. And Sun Yat-sen, his idea was to create Shanghai into a great Eastern harbor city equivalent to New York. And that would be a Chinese Shanghai to compete against and ultimately prevail over or take back the foreign Shanghai. And in 1931, and the nationalist government, after it had sort of like national unification, the nationalist government, they established the capital city in Nanjing, and they established Shanghai as a special municipality. And they immediately launched a new so-called Greater Shanghai Plan to build a new Shanghai city center. And this new Shanghai city center is in today's Wujiaochang in Shanghai. And again, to separate the new city center from the old city center of the foreign settlement, the Bounce area. And again, this is a nationalist plan. I call it a nationalist plan for two reasons, because it was undertaken by the nationalist government the pre-communist regime in 1949. And also, these plans had a great nationalism goal to build a new Shanghai and a new China to counter the foreign settlements or foreign existence of Shanghai. And as we could tell, these great schemes were utopian and unfulfilled because of the political fragmentation and the civil wars and foreign presence and invasion. And it was under great financial constraint. And Sun Yat-sen's plan was great, but his plan heavily relied on international investment. However, intellectually, culturally, and this nationalist plan played a very important role in the genesis of modern planning and city making in China. And they were also probably the earliest modern effort of making a new city and build a nation, and a major theme that I'm going to discuss further in this presentation. So, Shanghai's trajectory of development was fundamentally changed after 1949. So during 1950 to 70s, Shanghai was closed to the outside world, and despite its status as a global financial center before 1949. And Shanghai was also lost in 1980s, when China entered a new era of reform and opening up, because these two photos compared Shenzhen and as a fishing village to a global metropolis from 1980 and until 2020. So Shanghai lost the 1 decade time of 1980s when the 1980s Chinese cities, that was the that was the decade of Shenzhen, because the central government started to to build open the so-called special economic zones, and they started that in Guangdong province, because because of the political difference between the reformists and the conservatives. The conservatives were worried that given Shanghai's importance, because to open Shanghai could be risky. And so they would like to experiment the opening policy in Shenzhen or Guangdong first. So as a result, as the two lines show that Shanghai's economic weight in the national economy kept declining while Guangdong kept growing. So this gives Shanghai some pressure and some push to launch the Pudong project in the 1990s. So this is kind of like historical background. So as we all know that Pudong was Deng Xiaoping's project, but another historical context was that Pudong project came at a critical time of Deng's reform and opening agenda, because after the Tiananmen Square incident in 1989, Deng's agenda, Deng's liberal or reformist agenda, was in a kind of like difficulties overseas, also at home, because overseas the international embargoes and sanctions and the deteriorating relationship between China and the West. And at home, Deng was facing the political challenge from the conservatives. Look, and so Deng was in a sort of like a difficult situation to relaunch his modernization agenda. We have to admit that Deng was a great strategist, and he used Pudong as a sort of like what I call it crisis-led opportunity. And he said Pudong could be an ace card. Ace card is Deng's word because he loved playing bridge, and he used Pudong as a sort of like ace card to build a new Shanghai to drive the region and the nation's economy. Most importantly, he used Pudong as a sort of like his political finale, because he was very old in his 80s, to relaunch his modernization agenda of reform and opening up after the Tiananmen Square and the conservatives' prevalence in the political climate at the time. And he even threatened to change the leadership at the time. And Deng was lucky because he had a very good aide, and Zhu Rongji, the Shanghai mayor, unusually entrepreneurial, a leader. He drew and led the initial idea of Pudong, and Zhu was also promoted to the central government. And in his role as the vice premier, he was put in charge of the national economic reform and overseeing. So in a way, Deng and Zhu, they shared certain, mindsets in liberalizing the economy and further pushing forward the national economic strategies. That macroeconomic reforms and restructuring in the 1990s, in a way, laid the foundation of the nation's economic transformation or growth in much of the 21st century. So Deng had a very famous, quote here: "Hold fast to the development of Pudong and not waver until it is built in 1991." So this is the early, political and context of the Pudong strategy. Indeed, it was Deng's project and Deng's vision to push forward this project. So at operational level, and Zhu Rongji and his colleagues set two principles. One was the financing first, because money first, then the planning first. We could one point I'd like to highlight here is the Pudong practices and international learning, and how to develop such a mega project. And so the two cities, international cities with strong Chinese cultural background, Hong Kong and Singapore, set very good examples and for international learnings. For example, they set 4 development zones, and they put infrastructure investment and land financing and land subleasing to the to developers. So all of these, the ideas, they're not new today, but they were new learnings 30 years ago, and they learned from those overseas cities. Also, in terms of the project, they learned from other international cities like La Défense in Paris, Manhattan in New York, Chicago, and all of those, those urban forms we observe in Pudong today, and we could tell, where they originated from. And for example, including the World Expo idea, and they learned the idea from Tsukuba in Tokyo, Japan, and a Disney resort from Los Angeles. So what we can see in Pudong today, all of the ideas were mapped and envisioned in early 1990s. So here I'd like to highlight a key point in growing Pudong, that is the foreign direct investment from 1990 to 2015. And so indeed, the foreign investment played probably the most important role in growing not just Pudong in Shanghai and other coastal cities in China. And you could also tell that Hong Kong played an unusually important role in growing Pudong, and of course in growing other cities. And in a way, and in China's opening to the outer side world was first of all open to Hong Kong. So that's why, when we debate about Hong Kong's situation today, and linking this part of Hong Kong's history and Hong Kong's role in China's rise, and it's very important to recognize Hong Kong's strategic role. Look, I just talk about international learning, and in the official government marketing or discourse of Pudong, they say that in Pudong we borrowed international ideas, we solicited the best ideas. In a way, it is true, but it is not exactly so. Here, I would like to further unpack the international ideas in shaping Pudong. In the Lujiazui CBD, and they had an international design consultation in 1992, inviting the schemes from leading international designers, and they also had a very high-end international assessment. And you could tell that those international schemes, they are very imaginative and even poetic, but they're not so, in a way, they're not so realistic. They don't seem to recognize the local settings and etc. And in the end, what we see Pudong as it is today is more a kind of like Chinese plan, and in part, borrowed some international ideas, but the whole plan itself is not international. It is a Chinese plan, and based on a local planning expertise and wisdom, and this is the team who worked on the final plan for implementation. And in the end, so despite the fact that there was an international design consultation and some international involvement. So here is a list of several urban icons to showcase the progression of the project. And if we visit Shanghai today, and especially when we sit in the Bund, observing the landscape, the urban image of Pudong, and we would be impressed by what we see. and the trio of super high rises. And this idea were to have 3 super high rises. The idea was established in 1990 because the planners at the time felt that a global CBD like Manhattan and Chicago, they all had high rises to anchor the city's skyline. And so the first tower was completed in 1998, and the second tower was completed in 2008, and the last one and the tallest, the Shanghai Tower, was completed in 2016. And the Shanghai Tower now is the second tallest building in the world. And World Expo happened in 2010. Disney Resort opened in 2016. I just want to show the time span of all of this project mapped out in the very early stage of planning, and they were implemented in the subsequent 2 or 3 decades. So as I said in the very beginning, and we, the 2 authors, used the Shanghai Pudong as a prism to better understand the city making with Chinese characteristics. We could tell that the political will and given the Chinese unitary centralized governance system, political will played the utmost important role in making such a transformation possible. So more importantly, and this point was often overlooked in the reading, especially the international reading of China's transformation of Chinese cities, this is a city project, but this is also a project of nation building and modernization. And regardless of the political change between the communist regime and the nationalist regime, as I showed in the very beginning, so in the communist regime, and Shanghai was linked with the nation's building and modernization. And in the nationalist government between 1949, they had a similar vision of redeveloping Shanghai into a global metropolis to drive the nation's transformation. And the second key point is long-termism, and it's a long-term plan. And several generations of leaders and very entrepreneurial leaders and workers and business and involvement and very strong pragmatism. And it is very outcome oriented. And Deng was, he was not interested in debating. And for him, debating was a waste of time. And he said that no debating, it was my invention. And let's just do it and make it happen. And the third point is that we could tell some linkage between globalization and the Chinese urbanization, and globalization and localization. And it's not just international borrowing. They adapt some international learning and put them in the local context. To at the end of the day, we could say that this is an international CBD, but the wisdom and the underlying thinking and it's very Chinese. The last point is that to what extent is very likely that we could rebuild a Pudong, and we have to admit that the timing is everything. The timing was right to build a city like a Pudong or Shenzhen in 1990s or early 1980s. Because at the time, the whole nation and the whole world are transforming. It seemed to be in the right way, and China is increasingly integrated with the world. And we had a generally, friendly West, and that was willing to share, know-how, management, knowledge, and and investment. And so I think, when we talk about this sort of like historical event, we have to admit that the timing was very, very important. Here, of course, we will have plenty of points to discuss, but here I think these 4 points are worth noting from my perspective. So if we look at the urbanization rate of China and the world, we could see how the whole nation and has transformed in terms of urbanization from 1950 until today. And the change and, happened, mostly in 1990s. What's the future of Shanghai? And I'd like to use the latest strategic plan of the city that is called Shanghai 2035. And it set 2 visions of the city in the next 2 decades. It is an excellent global city, because Shanghai is already a global city in any sense. And the challenge is, how Shanghai could be an excellent global city, and to shifting its status from an emerging global city to become a leading global city. And the second vision is an international center of economy, finance, trade, shipping, and science tech innovation. So these are the 2 the visions set in the latest master plan of the city, and to guide the city's development in the next 2 decades. So I think I should stop here, and of course, and I cannot cover the whole book, and within this short presentation, I'm happy to have a discussion and answer questions from everybody. Thank you very much.
Hey, that was great. I hope everybody can hear me. We have one question already, and the question is about how was Shanghai chosen, number one, and it's in the book. And I would say, I think maybe Richard could talk about the Yangtze Delta area and how it fits into the rest of China. But let me do a couple of points to kind of not reiterate, but to focus on what Richard has said. I think this Shanghai and the Pudong New area, it is Shanghai. This is about China, China's mind, and I think it goes to 1860, just after the Opium Wars. The strengthening that happened to say this is what we need to do, or let's find out what we're going to need to do, and we see it moving ahead from that time to the current days. Also, you talked about Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and they essentially said, we need to have sovereignty. All of these foreigners here, it's not correct. And so Sun Yat-sen, Chiang Kai-shek, and then all the way on to the present day, that mindset is there. But they had to wrestle with the idea of, wow, we get some benefit from this. We have this foreign DNA that other places don't have. So I think that's a very, very important piece. So Shanghai DNA has brought a lot of genes here, including, think about Deng. Deng was injected with DNA. He went to France. If he had stayed in Sichuan, what would we have? We'd have 2 Maos. Because of globalism, because of internationalism, we have Deng, and then we have all of these changes in Shenzhen and Shanghai. So Shenzhen also had a healthy batch of that foreign DNA. I want to end up for saying the kinds of things that you have said. Finance in Shanghai is so important. Also shipping, science, now aviation, biotech, it's all here. But I think it's a manifestation of the entirety of China and how the thinking has been progressing since the 1860s. So why don't you go back and talk about what would happen would Shanghai just come, or would it come in a different way? Richard.
Sorry, could you please repeat the last question? I missed a little bit of that.
Yeah, the question was, let me bring up the question again. Okay, I'll just get the question. Why was Shanghai chosen to be rebuilt in the first place? Was it due to its location importance?
Yeah, I see. Yes, Shanghai, I think Rick has a lot addressed this point. I'd like to reiterate a bit, because Shanghai was the prime city in China. Shanghai is so-called the dragon's head. You know, if they have the Yangtze River as a dragon, Shanghai is the head. And Shanghai, because when you grow a new city, and it's very unlikely a new city will grow out of, it could be in the middle of nowhere. Pudong could grow because of Puxi is already there. Shenzhen could grow because Hong Kong is already there. So that's why, you know, Pudong was selected as the location for development because of the existing base there.
We've got good questions. So let me, Zhao Ma says, thank you, Professor Hu. Great talk. It seems like the Chinese government played decisive role, not just the Shanghai Chinese government, but the national government. And so I agree with that also. I'm curious what the role the government plays now after creating Pudong's physical skyline and financial structure. Does it let private sectors and foreign investors play a bigger role? Go ahead, Richard.
In China, of course, in most countries, and to my best knowledge, of course, government and government regulation and policy and definitely play the very important role. And this is especially so in China. And the recent tide seems to be changing a little bit with the growth of the state-owned enterprises. They seem to play more important role than, you know, than the private sector or the foreign enterprises compared with 20 years ago. This is especially so in Shanghai compared with Shenzhen. In Shenzhen, you could tell that, you know, the private sector could play a more important role. But in Shanghai, and one criticism to Shanghai's economic base is that the state-owned enterprises play a dominant role. And, you know, as I just explained in the very beginning, given Shanghai's importance, and it's very unlikely for the government to completely unleash, you know, its control of the city's economy. So I won't make any judgment that is right or wrong, and I just try to present what I know is that the state-owned enterprises and the government would continue to play a very important role in Shanghai, at least. Maybe in Shenzhen or Guangdong, the story is a little bit different.
Okay, Melody Lee says, thanks for the interesting and visually rich presentation. She wonders if, I think it's definitely a woman. She wonders if you have looked at Ofan's book, Shanghai Modern, and he talks about things like dance halls and other kinds of must-be Western kind of injections. Do you see parallels that people make with Shanghai and New York and other kinds of things? Do you know the book?
I know the book, but I didn't read it in detail. And I just browsed quickly because my focus is more kind of like economic and spatial. I'm an urban designer, and I know that the book is more about the culture and aspect. Yeah.
We have a we have a question regarding the structure of the urban residents, especially immigrants, who played building cities and shaping cultures. The question is, who are the people in Pudong now? And when I look at this, I think, well, there's international people, but just like Shenzhen, people have been coming from all over the place from China. So you want to kind of like move that forward? What do you think?
That's the aspect that my book failed to pay sufficient attention, or that could be, you know, a different type of book that should cover. behind under the urban image, there is significant social transformation, even social dislocation. And definitely this is a process of fundamental, not just a physical change, but also social economic change. And the original residents were relocated or dislocated or displaced in different ways. And that's part of the macro process of transformation. And of course, we have different ways of understanding or unwrapping that. And I also noticed that some publications have been produced in that regard. And so what I can share is that, compared with elsewhere, Pudong or Shanghai seem to tackle that issue and in a better way, because those original residents, the government funded them or built new residences for them so that places could be redeveloped into those commercial spaces.
Actually, at the very end of your book, I think that you started talking about how does it feel to live in that place? What's available? There's so much office space, but not places to do things that are much more, what shall I say, human friendly. And I think you also talked about now Science City and Finance City and talking about cities. So you talked about that in the book, and you must have another book in mind already.
I did from an urbanist perspective, because my book is not celebrating or praising something. My book is presenting things as it has happened or as it is. From an urbanist perspective, I'm personally not a fan of that kind of modernist or post-modernist urban structure. And it's put the human scale, as a pedestrian walking through the Pudong and CBD, you feel you're very small in the middle of nowhere or in the middle of a jungle, But I think they are starting to address that issue. That now we can see that there is a pedestrian bridge linking different buildings, etc. Planners have been learning as well, and they realized some problem. And I talked, both Wei Jie and I shared a common view that Pudong, even though we have those buildings, Pudong is still on the way to become a city. A city, I mean, a place for people to work, to live, to have culture, to interact, to socialize. That kind of elements and dimensions are still, they're not there yet. But it takes time to grow and to plan. And I think that could be the next, probably a project in the next, 2 or 3 decades.
We have another question that I'll kind of rephrase it, that China is using Shanghai to say, we're moving ahead. We've accomplished all of these kinds of things. Take a look. And yet there's a kind of now a feel that there's a kind of some friction, and maybe between other capitals, the United States, Europe, maybe other places. The current situation with regard to whatever we phrase it, do you think it will impact Shanghai negatively in the short term or the longer term?
Shanghai, probably we don't have to take it whether that's positively or negatively, given the presence of such a city. And, we always have different, angles and different readings and interpretations. As I just said that, our book tried to provide one perspective. And we believe that the reading of Shanghai is mixed with, readings, misreadings. Is that a miracle or mirage? And there are also mystifications, dismystifications. It's so complex. And what we try to do is that we try to provide things from a sort of insider's perspective and giving our experience with this project for at least 2 decades. So I don't think, for even for Shanghai and Pudong, the project itself, it is open, and it should be open to different ways of reading and interpretations.
Zhao Ma has another question, and Zhao Ma chimes in with the conversation that we had earlier, Xiang'an. And so we've been talking about Xiang'an. The question is, I wonder if policymakers and the city planners today borrow any experiences from their Pudong work. And let me just do a positive there. And I think in the book you talked about cities all over China are getting what I would call information and design and ideas from Shanghai. So what do you think about Xiang'an?
Xiong'an definitely is taking a different approach from Pudong in terms of urban image. For example, in Pudong, we could tell that the planners were very keen to have super high rises to symbolize the city and the nation. But that idea is not there with Xiong'an. And Xiong'an, those concepts like human-centric, humanistic, culture, history, and that kind of like in Xiong'an's plans so far, we don't seem to see a similar, mega project, mega buildings. Definitely, they're learning something from Pudong. And their idea is that, Pudong belonged to the 1990s, and Xiong'an is the 21st century project. We don't know, maybe 30 years later, when we talk about Xiong'an, we will have some new insights or new lessons and to inform. That's sort of like, for me, a cyclical or helix way of human learning, So and Zhao Ma, I think it's right that, the Xiong'an project is built upon the success as well as the lessons of both Shenzhen and Pudong.
Yeah, let me follow on with that. We've been looking at this in the MBA and the business school since it was announced. And my sense was that thanks to two things, subway and very high-speed rail, and maybe even maglev that's even higher, I think the idea of Xiang'an and the region and Beijing is an opportunity to make Beijing less dense in terms of impactfulness of people there. So you can spread people out maybe it has a different kind of purpose than we have. And I think that's what you said in Pudong.
You're right, definitely, because Xiong'an was established to alleviate the so-called big city syndrome problem of Beijing, because Beijing's traffic and Beijing's density and pollution, very, very problematic, in the past 2 decades. So Beijing should not continue to grow in the way it has been growing in the past 40 years. So Xiong'an's purpose was then Beijing would be kind of like, focused more on its role as the capital city and a culture center. And those so-called non-capital functions, activities would be relocated to Xiong'an. Yeah.
I want to say, hey, Addie Cao is here. She's from our office in Shanghai. She's a Webster person, and she's still on for us. And I'm going to move on for when I was talking about high-speed trains and subways. I found like one piece in in the book where you're talking about subways, but these subways are incredible here in Shanghai, and it really moves people from one place to the other very, very quickly. And maybe you don't necessarily have to live at a place that's a trophy area because you have so much mobility and it's so fast. In addition to that, you might say, oh, I'll take a DD today, but you go to the DD and the DD doesn't go anywhere. The subway just bullets to the next place, and there's so many of them. What do you think is the ultimate contribution with that kind of a subway system?
In both Shanghai, including Beijing and many cities, the subway system planning, in a way, lagged behind urban development. That's a planning problem because planners made mistakes. They couldn't predict everything in the future. For example, including Pudong, given the density of Pudong developed to a certain stage. Then they realized that our traffic was a problem. We need more public transit. So a major boost of the subway system in Shanghai happened before the World Expo 2010. So the mega event boosted the infrastructure investment and significant lifting. So you could tell that, so the subway system is very convenient, is working pretty well, but it's not so idealized yet. So our idealized scenario is that we put the subway system first, then we design the development. But in China, the cities and urban development, they have been so fast, so overwhelming, and so in many cases it's the opposite. It's just they failed to put the horse before the cart. They put the cart before the horse. So even though it's fine, but they could be better.
I want to ask, let's see, if Patty, are you still there? Do we have any questions from you guys?
I'd like to know a little bit more about Xiong'an. I know you compared Shanghai with Shenzhen already. For Xiong'an, can you tell a little bit more about the story, how this was planned, when this plan started, and where it is now? That will be very helpful.
Shanghai is a very interesting case. When I summarized the takeaways of Pudong and the Chinese cities, I think I said timing is right. I think timing is very, very important. Xiong'an, for me, because when Shenzhen and Pudong were developed, since the timing was right at the time, because Xiong'an is a very interesting case because the planning of Xiong'an was kept confidential for 2 years until it was announced on the 1st of April 2014. But the timing is different. Compared with Pudong and in Xiong'an, they don't have to worry about funding. And they don't have to worry about money. And they don't have to rely on foreign investment because the state-owned enterprises, the government has huge amount of funding and money. And Xiong'an now is a new construction site because what I can tell is that Xiong'an in Pudong is government-led, but the whole process is market-based, including Shenzhen. But Xiong'an seems to me that follows a different trajectory, and it came from a very strong top-down political will, or even personal political will. That's my personal reading. And the whole development so far, planning, infrastructure building, it's a totally public funding or state-owned enterprises. I cannot tell any strong private presence or strong foreign investment, and so it's a totally different scenario. However, for a major city targeting a population of 4 million and 5 million people, at the end of the day, it has to be market-based. But so that's what I call the Xiong'an paradox. The Xiong'an paradox between a political will, government action and intervention and endorsement, and a lack of market mechanism or market future. At the end of the day, if we want to grow a booming city, a new city, it has to be market-based. So I I would be interested to observe Xiong'an, how it will grow and how Xiong'an is going to shift from a government project to a market project. So the government presence is very strong, but the market presence is not there yet. So that's my reading of Xiong'an so far.
Yeah, we have also a comment here said perhaps designer and policymaker never see Xiong'an as a city, but as an administrative center. Can we say that?
Yes and no. I like the point. Let me put it in this way. Designers and policymakers see Xiong'an as a government project, as an administrative project. But the purpose, they don't mean to design a city of administrative center. On the contrary, they would like to keep Beijing as an administrative center. And they would like to relocate those non-administrative functions to Xiong'an, for example, financial banking and education and etc. to Xiong'an. And even though the high-speed rail linked the two city, but making a new city is more than just the infrastructure. So in that regard, that's what I call the Xiong'an paradox. I'm not sure how they could manage to make those non-political, non-administrative services and functions that are market-based into Xiong'an, a government-led project,
Yeah, right. Thank you. All right. So Rick, you have other questions? Can we?
The wrap-up question, because we're almost there. I want to say that how the government nationally looked at Shanghai and Pudong tells us a lot about the idea of ideation, having an idea to do something, whether it's Disney or Expo, because they want to have an outcome. And the ideation moves to plans. The plans foment in terms of a product, and then there's the finance. And so it's all in the book. I think we see it time and time again throughout China, and it's a method that China uses.
Yes, indeed, and I think for such a major urban development project as part of nation building and the long-termism and the consistent planning and action and commitment to regardless of political changes or leadership changes, but the same vision should stay on. I think that's a critical point.
I was thinking about the 40-minute rule with regard to commuting. I think probably as an urban planner, Richard knows about that. And I was also thinking about the ride between Beijing and the new city. If it's 40 minutes, it's a commute. It's a very, very reasonable commute. And I think it takes a lot of pressure off of Beijing. And it makes the two areas livable. And also, Beijing is different than any other capital in the world. It is centralized, it's important, it's more important than even Washington, because Washington is 50 states and cities and all kinds of things. I think Beijing is different and needs to have some room.
Yes, you're right. Beijing's population is simply next to Shanghai in the Chinese urban system. And Beijing's traffic condition is much worse than Shanghai, actually, because they build the cities circle by circle, spreading across, following the Moscow's Soviet style.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. Thank you both for this very informational and very insightful discussion. And your book is very helpful to anyone looking to understand China's rise as a leading force in global trade and finance. And the story is also a key to understand China. And I hope to read your book about Shenzhen soon, and when it's available on Amazon.
It's already available.
Oh, it's already, I see. Yeah, good, good. Yeah. Yeah, we will get it and start to read about it. And thank you, Rick, too, for the nice questions and for your insights.
Yeah, and thanks for putting it on. Thanks for Confucius, St. Louis, Webster, those guys. Great job. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.